G'day mate, 40 here. So for years prior to Israel's pager attack on Hezbollah leaders, all the elites were saying that Hezbollah had the ability to essentially flatten Israel's biggest cities, Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And there was one exception to that line of analysis that I encountered, and that was from one of those Christian networks that broadcast online from Israel on a near daily basis. I think something like TBN. And the analysts there went through what would happen if Hezbollah expanded its rocket attacks on Israel, what would happen if Iran launched ballistic missiles at Israel. He said if an Iranian or Hezbollah rocket lands, right, they would damage the building that they hit, but they wouldn't blow up an entire block. So in the worst kind of Hezbollah and Iranian rocket attacks on Israel, we'd be talking at most dozens of casualties, not thousands. So the elite news media talked about 20,000 Israelis would be dead in the first day of a Hezbollah attack. But there was one exception. That was this dude on something like TBN, Christian, broadcasting from Jerusalem. And he ended up giving the most accurate analysis of what would happen with a massive Hezbollah, all-out Hezbollah or Iranian barrage at Israel. That the casualties would not nearly be as catastrophic as what the elite consensus told us. Listening to Mark Halperin's show this morning, and I'm glad to hear Mark Halperin and his show getting all the attention that they deserve from other pundits. That this election very much feels as though all the other pundits, political prognosticators, political reporters and analysts are following in the footsteps of Mark Halperin, Sean Spicer, Dan Turrentine. Halperin is leading the way in the 2024 election analysis. Just everyone else seems to be following in his footsteps. And if you want to get ahead of the curve, then check out his now twice daily shows. And this morning, there's a Kamala Harris voter from Arizona who said that he thought that Trump voters would be much more resilient than Kamala Harris voters. That if Donald Trump loses, that Trump voters will be much more resilient, much better able to get on with their lives. I remember 2016, there were all these Hillary supporters who just took to bed, all right, for weeks after the election, did not show up to work, did not show up to life, did not show up for their responsibilities. They'd poured so much into the Hillary Clinton campaign, and it did not go their way. They took to bed, which is amazing, because I find it impossible to imagine that any Trump voter would take to bed if the election doesn't go his way. Hey, where is Pune? So I am walking in Westwood, about 5 miles east of the Pacific Ocean, next to the University of California at Los Angeles. And so this Kamala Harris voter said that he notices among professionals, doctors, lawyers, accountants, dentists, he notices a ton of heavy drinking to soothe their anxiety. And Mark Halperin predicts a massive mental health crisis on the left if Donald Trump is elected, with descent into alcoholism, drug addiction, and various forms of dysfunction. If you know Trump supporters, can you picture any of them taking to bed with depression if Trump loses? No, a Trump supporter will just get on with his life, spend time with his family, with his friends, go to work. Can't imagine checking out of your adult responsibilities simply because the politics do not go your way. And so the number one reason that Trump supporters are much more have less invested in themselves. They're less worried about institutional racism, institutional sexism, institutional homophobia and Islamophobia. They're less invested in politics, more invested in their families, in their faith, in their religion, their community, their friends, their work, their hobbies. And they get less meaning in life out of politics. Because the more your identity and your sense of well-being depends on outcomes outside of yourself, right, the more vulnerable you are. Another theme that I notice in discussion about the current election is that liberals are filled with fear, trembling, and anxiety, while Trump supporters are having a great time. So the liberals can't wait for this to be over. Right? They just can't live with this fear and anxiety any longer, while Trump supporters are just enjoying themselves. And if you look at the vibe of the campaign, all right, Trump and his team are having fun, and Kamala and her team look as though they're under great pressure. They look haggard and angry and anxious. It's amusing that Kamala Harris began her campaign on the vibes of joy, right, which seem much more accurately described as the vibes of alcohol or benzodiazepine or some kind of substance addiction that she's got going on. Right, a lot of heavy drinkers will, under the influence of spirits, give off the vibe of joy. So why did Kamala Harris switch away from that campaign theme? Because the private polling showed that she was losing. Right, if that was a winning campaign, they would have stuck to it. Another mark of losing campaign is when your messaging is all over the place. And Kamala Harris's messaging just keeps changing. From we're all about joy to Trump and J.D. Vance and the Republicans are weird. Remember their weird campaign? They don't talk about that anymore. Why don't they talk about what was a major campaign theme for about a month? Because it's not landing. It doesn't work. And so they shifted from being the upbeat party to primarily emphasizing abortion. And then they tried to lay out an economic platform that was just weak. It was essentially trying to fix prices in groceries and rent that even many of her supporters found unconvincing. Then about 10 days ago, they got all in on calling Donald Trump and his supporters fascists. But even the number one Kamala Harris super PAC said that's not a winning message, so they've backed off from that. And Kamala is so afraid of making a decision. She's so afraid of being decisive that she's unwilling to state definitively or repeatedly that that Donald Trump is a fascist. And all the people who are calling Trump fascist, almost none of them are experts in fascism. Right? The people who are experts in fascism, the historians, they are the one group who are most reluctant to call Donald Trump a fascist. It's a bit like the appeal of Christianity. Jesus was a Jew. His entire life was spent among Jews, and Jews remained stubbornly for 2,000 years the one group most resistant to the claims made for Jesus. And the one group who knows the most about fascism, historians of fascism, are the least likely ones to endorse this crazy idea that Donald Trump is some kind of dangerous fascist. But I see a lot of opinion pieces, such as Charles Pierce in Esquire, saying, how can't this election be over already? That seems to be the overwhelming sentiment of the liberal elite. Can't this election be over already? And I notice a lot of liberals have said out loud, like, I don't know how I'm going to go on. I don't know how I'm going to cope if Donald Trump wins. It's going to profoundly affect their relationship to America. So my relationship to America was affected by the gay marriage decision. That our country would say that marriage between two members of the same sex is legal and is law of the land. It's such a moral abomination from my hero system, from where I stand in Orthodox Judaism, that it turned my stomach, and it did affect my relationship with America. I've had a more distant relationship with America since the Obergefell decision legalizing gay marriage in every state. And now for liberals, if Donald Trump is elected, it's going to profoundly affect their relationship with America. It's going to profoundly affect their relationship with their fellow Americans. Liberals, far more than conservatives, are unwilling to have friends who have a different politics from them. I hear almost nothing from conservatives, Republicans, Trump supporters that Kamala Harris voters are bad people or are garbage. Right? You just don't hear that kind of talk from Republicans or conservatives. They don't think that Democrats are bad people. But overwhelmingly, it seems that a large number of the liberal and left-wing elite believe in their core that supporters of Donald Trump are bad people. Example number one, Susan Glasser, writer for The New Yorker, married to Peter Baker, New York Times political reporter and author of many books, many of which I've bought, listened to on Audible, quite enjoyed. Together they did a book on Donald Trump, and the book had almost nothing positive to say about Donald Trump. It was just one long book-length denunciation of Trump. And Bob Woodward does the same thing. His book, War. Actually, nothing positive to say about Donald Trump. Bob Woodward explicitly states that Donald Trump would be a reckless president, completely irresponsible, that there's no way that he should be entrusted with a leadership position, let alone leadership of the country. Woodward similarly has contempt for Bibi Netanyahu. Anyway, Susan Glasser in The New Yorker today, she describes her visit to Madison Square Garden, and she describes the Trump rally at Madison Square Garden on Sunday as the banality of evil. Like the banality of evil. And she notes that the attendees were law-abiding, they were polite, they were perfectly respectable in their behavior, but it was in their political views that she found that they were the embodiment of evil. So people who were law-abiding, courteous, nice, polite, but in her view, they were completely evil simply on the basis of their politics. And you don't find this type of denunciation nearly as much on the right. Bob Woodward, in his book, describes Joe Biden's foreign policy team as these thoughtful, humane, learned, cohesive strategists whose tactics and methods will be studied for generations to come. And it's overwhelmingly a positive portrayal of Anthony Blinken and Joe Biden's team, and overwhelmingly a contemptuous portrayal of Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu. And Donald Trump did not speak to Bob Woodward. Don't get any sense that Bibi Netanyahu spoke to Bob Woodward. So overwhelmingly, it seems that Trump's team and Bibi's team would not talk to Bob Woodward. And as a result, Bob Woodward just fell in with the group that spoke to him. Right? Because he got access to Biden's foreign policy team. then he just completely took their side. And you hear him articulate the thinking and the strategy of Biden's team, and it all sounds so reasonable and thoughtful. And the philosophical, measured, scholarly, detached, academic, reflexive, buffered, enlightenment, rational, strategic, autonomous approach of Biden's team just makes sense on the level of words, but on the level of results, it's just been an absolute disaster. And so your membership in the new class, the ruling class, the educated class, is largely dependent on how well do you use words, how well have you mastered careful critical discourse. And the Biden team has mastered that careful critical discourse. But Woodward has no sense of judgment. The results don't matter so much for him. It's the words and the words that they gave to him. One team gave him the words and he fell in love with them. Striking thing about this 2024 American presidential election campaign is how little Kamala Harris has campaigned on policy. So Donald Trump has run 100% on policy, 100% on substance. That we need to realign our trading system, our economic system, with what's in the interests of Americans. He appeals to American citizens, and he has the audaciousness to put the interest of Americans first. I mean, is there anything more racist than putting the interests of American citizens ahead of the interests of non-American citizens? Now, from an elite perspective, right, this is chauvinist, nativist, racist. I remember my UCLA economics professor, Russell Roberts, who now hosts the podcast Econ Talk, and he runs a small college in Jerusalem, Israel, liberal arts college. But when he was talking about the virtue of free trade, he said half the reason that he favors free trade with China is because it's good for the Chinese. Right? The interest of the Chinese is just as important to Russell Roberts and to much of our elite as the interest of Americans, which seems absurd to me. Right? I would expect the government of the United States to put American citizens as their top priority, not the Chinese. There's a great observation made on Mark Halperin's show this morning that under Donald Trump, Washington, D.C. was in chaos and the world was at peace. Under Joe Biden, Washington, D.C. was at peace and the world was in chaos. And Sean Spicer says it's a choice between WWE and World War III. So WWE refers to wrestling, and just listen to an Audible biography of the main bloke, Jim McMahon, is it? Behind WWE. Was Jim McMahon the quarterback of the Bears? But anyway, Vince McMahon. And so wrestling, that kind of theatrical production is a much bigger deal in parts of America than your average American thinks about. Like, I don't think about professional wrestling. It's just completely foreign to me. There's nothing in professional wrestling that captures my attention or is much of interest to me. But if Donald Trump has a close friend, it's probably Vince McMahon. But Donald Trump is probably closer to Vince McMahon than he is to any other possible friend. And they both enjoy putting on a great performance. And Donald Trump loves being at the center of drama and attention, and he does create chaos around him, while simultaneously operating an administration that does not get America involved in more forever wars and that landed unprecedented Abraham Accords in the Middle East, creating normal relations between several Sunni Arab states and the Jewish state of Israel. Right? They had unprecedented success with the Middle East. But because Trump sounds so chaotic and frenzied and talks in these vulgar wrestling terms, he's frightening to many people. While Joe Biden and his team who speak in such humane, careful, critical discourse, right? They sound strategic and humane and thoughtful, but the results on the ground are just chaotic and awful. So it was about 3 weeks ago that Mark Halperin came out on the morning show and said that if these early voting results hold, that we'll know by election day that Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States. He seems to have backed off a little bit from that, but the early voting trends that you referred to are more than 50% still in place. So even Kamala Harris supporters among political operatives, right, political professionals, still believe that Donald Trump is the strong favorite to win, because it's hard to see how Kamala will win any of the Sunbelt states. It's hard to see right now how Kamala could possibly win Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, or North Carolina. So that would mean Donald Trump would just have to win one of the Rust Belt states, either Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania. Trump is probably strongest in Michigan. So if Trump loses Georgia, winning the election would be much more difficult. But Republicans sound confident that Trump has Georgia and North Carolina, Arizona, and Nevada in hand. Michigan looks to be the most difficult of the Rust Belt states for Trump to win. And independent political professionals, Republican political professionals, many Democratic political professionals still see Trump on a glide path to victory, one that will be clear by about 9:30 p.m. East Coast time. So 6:30 p.m. West Coast time on election day, we should know who's won the election. Mark Halperin was talking 2 months ago how Republican political operatives feel sure that independents are going to swing towards Trump, and perhaps a better understanding of the independent voter is the voter who doesn't like Donald Trump but is going to vote for him anyway, because on substance they see his policies as more aligned with the American national interest. There's considerable discussion about the relative strength of the ground game, that Kamala Harris supposedly has a much more professional and definitely much better funded ground game, right? There's no doubt Kamala Harris has much more money than Donald Trump. There's no doubt that she has much more of a ground game, that Donald Trump has to rely on outside groups such as Charlie Kirk. But in 2016, Donald Trump had zero ground game, and he still won. So Donald Trump has far more ground game now than he did in 2016. So to go from a place where you have zero ground game and you still win the election to an early vote indicating an effective ground game, I don't see how the Democratic ground game advantage is nearly as strong and as comprehensive as many in the media have talked about. Right? Trump won in 2016 with no ground game. I was looking at a poll today that said Kamala Harris, or the aggregation of polls that said Kamala Harris had a 10-point advantage in voter enthusiasm, which does not align with other things I see. So the extent to which there is Kamala Harris voter enthusiasm, it's enthusiasm for anyone who's not Donald Trump, because Kamala Harris has completely failed to make a case for why she would be a good president. She's failed to articulate policies about how she would help the average American, right? For those who don't own their own home and don't have a sizable 401k program, right? The last 3.5 years under Joe Biden have been an economic loser. And nothing that Kamala Harris has said would appeal for people in this position. And the argument that Donald Trump is a fascist, it simply doesn't land with working class voters. If you're struggling to pay the bills week in, week out, right? This rhetoric that Donald Trump is some fearsome fascist, it's not going to be on top of your concerns. Now, this week I was reading articles with headlines that Mark Cuban makes the case for Kamala Harris better than Kamala Harris does. That Mark Cuban makes the case for Kamala Harris better than Kamala Harris's campaign does. Right, and so in the mainstream media and the left of center media, right, there's been all this praise for how articulately Mark Cuban makes the case for Kamala Harris. Then Mark Cuban comes out yesterday and says that look at the women around Donald Trump, none of them are strong women. And it gets zero media attention. So if the person who makes Donald Trump's case better than Donald Trump makes it, if a billionaire is articulating Donald Trump's program better than anyone in the Trump campaign, right? This kind of leading surrogate for Donald Trump came out and said something akin to what Mark Cuban said. It would garner massive mainstream media attention. But Mark Cuban's remark has received virtually no mainstream media attention. It's just completely ignored. So the media wants to talk for 6 days now on how awful it was that an insult comic, Donald Trump's Madison Square Garden, said some derogatory remark about Puerto Rico having a trash problem. But when Joe Biden comes out and calls Donald Trump supporters garbage, right, the media say, oh, it's all just a misplaced apostrophe. And now the stenographer who took the transcript of Biden's remarks, she's objected to how the White House changed the transcript and added an apostrophe where there was no apostrophe in Joe Biden's remarks. The White House is shifting the transcript against what the stenographers took down. And it's an ethical breach, and I was pleased to see that the Associated Press took up the story. No wonder that Kamala Harris doesn't want Joe Biden out there campaigning for her. He's just a walking, talking gaffe machine. So 1 minute he's talking about how you have to lock up Donald Trump. Next minute he's calling Trump supporters garbage. And you got Susan Glasser referring to a Trump rally as exemplifying the banality of evil. So there's no doubt that supporters of Kamala Harris are far more likely to view Donald Trump supporters as garbage than vice versa. Right? There's just no inclination on the part of Trump supporters to label Kamala supporters as garbage. It just doesn't come up. I don't know any Trump supporters who would not be friends with Democrats, liberals, Kamala Harris supporters. It's not a concern by people on the right. because politics is not their life. And so if someone has a different politics, it's not that important. But if religious faith is your life, then it'll be difficult for you to be friends with someone who's got a different religious faith than you do. But if theology is not your number one consideration in life, then it's not going to be a problem befriending, hanging out with people with a different theology than you. And for many of our elite, for much of the left and the liberals, and the liberals are the one group who most believes in the enlightenment and the power of reason, that through our own individual buffered, autonomous, strategic use of reason, we can decide right and wrong, meaning, purpose, morality, all on our own. Right? That's the embodiment of the liberal worldview. And so then if people look at things differently, it shows that they are deficient in reason, that they are outside the select, the elite, the anointed, that what used to be the normal human enthusiasm for religion is being replaced by much of the elite intelligentsia with enthusiasm for the power of reason, rationality, and a liberal left hero system. Okay, let's go to the chat. I am loving the fall weather. You're English, you don't even know what you're talking about. I'm Australian, and I would say I am better read, better informed on politics than 999 Americans out of 1,000. Yes, I heard about North Korea sending 10,000 troops to aid the battle in Ukraine. Guess what? It makes absolutely no difference to America. And I'd say the same thing if North Korea was sending 10,000 troops to aid Israel or to aid Hamas or aid Hezbollah. It makes no difference to America. They're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the pets, the people that live there. Both sides have been ramped up against the other. Never has political affiliation been such a wedge I can ever recall. No, for most people, politics is not the most important thing. We're talking about no more than 5% of the population. Why are Republican senators getting blown away in the polls, but Harris-Trump is neck and neck? That doesn't make sense. Some of these Democratic senators are incumbents. They've got the benefits of being incumbent. Some of them, all of them, are better funded than the Republicans. Yeah, the Elon Musk factor seems to be outweighing the George Soros factor in this election. This recorded live. This is very much live, mate. I'll never forget American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, the Nature Boy, Ric Flair, Bam Bam Bigelow. Entertained with pro wrestling when I was a young kid. I never got into it, so it's a foreign language to me, but now I've read a book on Vince McMahon, so I'm a little more informed. Only reason to say you're not able to respond to chat is when you're not live. Well, I had a bunch of thoughts that I wanted to get out before I looked at the chat. So you're wrong, it is very much live. I'm doing a walk and talk live, bro. Yeah, Mark Cuban just says a ton of idiotic things. But it doesn't get much mainstream media attention. Lock him up, Trump committed a crime. Well, if Trump loses the election, there's a very good chance he'll be locked up. Must be able to choose a leader who can provide jobs, can improve the morals of society with a leader's personality that can be an example for subordinates. So what kind of person looks to politicians for an example of how their kids should behave? Right? I think that's incredibly flawed thinking. Right? Why would you look to the President of the United States as your moral exemplar? That just strikes me as bizarre. I mean, I think this is a delusion largely on the left that you'd seek a president who's a moral exemplar. It was nice going back to Sydney, Australia. Wherever I went in Australia, spent 5 months in Australia in the last couple of years. And in those 5 months, I think I saw a total of 3 homeless people. If you can't look to someone who is in a leadership position as an example of how you should live, then they should not be in a leadership position. That strikes me as completely bizarre. All right? So if I was an employee, I would most want an employer, right? The leader of my company, someone who was competent at his job, someone who could excel and create a solid income for me so I can support my family, so that I can have health benefits and retirement benefits. And it wouldn't matter to me whether or not he was cheating on his wife, or if he cheated in golf, or even if he yelled at people. Right? The most important characteristic for a leader is, are they effective, not are they particularly moral. It is absolutely bizarre that you would look to leaders in secular life for moral exemplars. You must not be in an organized religion. Right? If you're in an organized religion, you have all sorts of people that you might look up to for moral leadership. Right? If you're a Christian, you'll look to the example of Jesus. You might have priests and pastors and saints who inspire you. If you're a Jew, you might have various rabbis who inspire you. Right? If you're a Muslim, you would have various leaders in your tradition who you may see as moral exemplars. I mean, what person looks to a football coach or the editor of a newspaper or the president of a university or the president of the United States or a politician or a business leader as their moral exemplar? That strikes me as completely bizarre reasoning. Like, it's just not morally serious. And there's no true moral character. Right? Someone who is ethical in how they run their business, not necessarily going to be ethical in the way they run their personal life. Someone who is honest and faithful to his wife, right, is not necessarily going to be honest and faithful in the way he pays taxes. Right? Morality is domain specific. So there are going to be domains of life where you consistently behave in an upright manner. And there are going to be other domains of life where you consistently do not behave in a righteous manner. Right? It is domain specific. Right? You'll find many accountants who are honest in the way they do their job, but then when they're off the job, they'll often behave in all sorts of sleazy ways. And other people who will behave uprightly and chastely in the way they date, right? They will cheat in business. People are complicated, bro. It's not like there's one form of moral character. And now I know how someone is because I see that they filled out their taxes honestly, or they conducted themselves uprightly on a date. Like, it's so tempting to simplify our moral estimation of people. So we'll usually give our friends the benefit of the doubt. And when they do something that appears to be wrong, we'll make all sorts of excuses for them. But I don't understand how a normal, sane, wise, thoughtful person thinks that their local politician, their national politician, their city or state leading politician, that the president of their company, that the head of their local university should be someone that they look up to for moral leadership. Right, think about Anthony Fauci. If, let's say Anthony Fauci was removed from his position in 2010, 2020, you would have had someone just like Anthony Fauci replace him, right? You only get to leadership position that Anthony Fauci was in by learning to play along in a big bureaucracy, to be an excellent bureaucratic player. And so there are all sorts of moral compromises that you have to make to maintain your standing in a large organization and to operate a large bureaucracy. And I think that Anthony Fauci, by and large, did a good job. I think that 90 to 95% of what he said was in alignment with the scientific consensus at the time that he said it. And that the notion that if we just had someone different in Anthony Fauci's position, that we would have been so much better served is bogus, because situations shape people just as much as people shape situations. The skills required to maneuver a large federal bureaucracy, such as what Anthony Fauci embodied, right, require a certain ethical flexibility. I love what one Orthodox rabbi said about Israel, that it'd be great if Israel were 5 to 10% more moral, more ethical, more humane in the way it waged its wars. But if Israel tried to be 50% more humane, it would disappear. So too with business. Right? Many businesses, if they were 50% more ethical, they would go out of business. They wouldn't exist. Competitive pressures force people in business to make ethical compromises. Some people are strong with sexual fidelity, other people are strong with financial fidelity. Some people are very strong at always crediting the sources of their information. I saw a full article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about how bosses are firing employees for all sorts of minor infractions. Because when you fire an employee for cause, you don't have to pay severance. And also, employers see it as a way to warn their other employees to be righteous and to be careful and to stay on their toes. So it's intimidating and challenging for other employees when they see other people being fired. Also, when you lay off people, it creates a depressing vibe in the workplace, and it creates a depressing public relations. Notice a lot more security at UCLA these days in case there's an outbreak of anti-Israel riots. And so businesses, instead of conducting layoffs, instead of laying people off and having to pay severance, they're now firing people for minor violations of how they spend a meal voucher, how they use a company credit card. Because while 2 years ago the employee had the whip hand, Now employers are in a much stronger position vis-a-vis their employees. You have fewer work from home opportunities. More and more companies are demanding that employees return to the office, and employers now feel like they have the power to demand this. And so as the relative power balance rises or falls between bosses and employees, the situation changes, and the type of behavior that bosses and employees will engage in will vary depending on the situation. Overall, employers are trying to extract the most work possible from employees while paying the least possible. Employees trying to do the least possible while extracting the most possible from employers. Okay, let's go back and look at the chat. I want a president of the United States, not a best friend. Am I okay with racism? Well, that's like asking, am I okay with unicorns? Right? There's no such moral sin as racism. It's entirely made up moral category. There's no such sin as Islamophobia or homophobia or ageism or sexism. These are just recent moral inventions. None of the great moral thinkers, great moral traditions in history have any such relevant categories. There's never been some great Orthodox rabbi who's published a book against racism or against bigotry or against sexism. Now, I understand different people have different hero systems, and for you, this is a very real peril. Simply a non-thing for me. Leadership is not an accentuation to power, but to subdue to duty people who don't understand that. Well, leadership is primarily about effectiveness, and that will require a wide variety of different strategies depending on the situation. The right leader is one who can lead fairly and equally to all levels of society. Well, you have a leader at work, you have a leader at school. I would say that effectiveness is far more important than any of these characteristics. If you are not an honest, moral person, you should not be a leader. You want your country to be seen as moral. Number one, I want my country to survive. Number one, I want my country to thrive. I would like people to do the right thing, and so I want social incentives in place, individual incentives, social structures in place to reward people for doing the right thing and to punish people for doing the wrong thing. There is no person who's honest throughout their life. Right? Nobody is moral throughout their life. People are unmoral in different domains of their life. People bound by rules will be oppressed by those who aren't. That's why moral leaders are so rare. Well, rules are often a good guide, but they're not the ultimate destination, right? Rules are the map. They're not the territory. There's a debate in Judaism, is just following Jewish law. Is that the sum total of being moral, or is there a moral dimension above and beyond just observance of Jewish law? And I would hold with the latter position. As Nachmanides put it, a medieval Jewish rabbi, you can be disgusting with permission for the Torah. Sit down for a little bit, take a rest. Maintaining power means removing opposition. Well, in some circumstances, right, to maintain power, you need to remove opposition. In other circumstances, a healthy debate with the opposition is good for you and good for your organization. People want to boil down life to a magic key that if people just followed the rules, or if we just understood the perfidy of the Jews, or of the Freemasons, or of this group or that group, if we just return to the gold standard, if we just had socialism, if we just had untrammeled capitalism, then most of our problems would be solved. And there's no magic key to life. There's no one simple perspective that provides all the needed clarity with just one narrative. That's what it means to live in a postmodern world, that no one narrative is sufficient for grappling with the complexity that we're faced with in life today. I read a great book on football and postmodernism. And so when you look at the results of a football game, you can write out that narrative 15 different ways. Perhaps the problem was the lack of pass rush last night on behalf of the Texans, who appeared to be the much better team, but they fell to the New York Jets, who overall have been playing poorly this year. So one narrative, you could argue, lack of pass rush on the part of the Texans. Another narrative you could argue for is that the Jets had a wide receiver who just made an extraordinary one-handed grab in the end zone. Another narrative was that Aaron Rodgers is back, top of his game, and the Jets quarterback led the Jets to victory. So there are 10 different narratives and explanations you can give for why the New York Jets defeated the Houston Texans last night. And so too with the world around us. After Donald Trump or Kamala Harris wins this election, right, there will be 15 different narratives about why the person won. Now, all these narratives won't have equal validity. So when I note that there's no one explanation, no one narrative that is sufficient to completely explain life, that doesn't mean that there aren't some explanations that are not superior to others, right? Certainly some narratives are more revealing, more important, have more explanatory and predictive power. So, for example, IQ. When you take the average IQ of groups, that has tremendous explanatory and predictive power. That IQ functions for people and their ability to navigate life very similar to the way that weight functions for an offensive lineman. Right? Unless you weigh at least 260 pounds, right, you're not going to play offensive line in the National Football League. But you can weigh 260 pounds and be nowhere near talented enough to play offensive line in the NFL. That's not the only factor in life. But compared to all psychometric testing we have, right, IQ has the most predictive and analytical ability. Right, it replicates the most in academic studies. It's the most powerful tool of the social sciences. Right. It's not a magic key for life, but it's about as close as we have to a magic key for life. So Mickey Cows came back with Robert Wright last night. Did one of their rare shows together. And Robert Wright is anxious and depressed. He's already expecting a Trump victory. He has all these explanations for why Kamala Harris will lose. And the number one explanation by many thoughtful people who want Kamala Harris to win is that she's never come out with any clear policies. And this is not because her team lacks the ability to produce a program. It's not because that she hasn't received the advice. It reflects her character that she is unwilling to make decisions. She's unwilling to risk infuriating people. This campaign has revealed that Kamala Harris, who performed so miserably that she had to quit her presidential campaign in 2019 before she even got to one caucus or primary. And her number one disability in operating a campaign is probably her lack of decisiveness. And what underlies that is such a deep, crippling level of insecurity. But all she does is babble pablum. Read words that are written for her. Right? She can give a prepared speech, and she did prepare well for the debate, and she did definitively defeat Donald Trump in that debate, but she gave no reason for undecided voters to side with her, even in the debate. So she definitely won on points, but there's nothing that she said that provided a strong explanation for why people would want to support her. And we're now 3 months, 2 weeks in since she launched her campaign, and she's still unable to articulate a case for herself, aside from "I'm not Donald Trump." So if she wins, it will be because a majority of voters simply do not want Donald Trump in the White House. There was no enthusiasm for Joe Biden in 2020. It was incredibly amusing to see the way that the news media has treated Joe Biden over the past 5 years. So initially in 2019, the news media treated Joe Biden with absolute contempt because he was the least progressive, he was the least of their favorite candidates. But then, when it became clear that he stood the best chance of defeating Donald Trump, the media just rallied completely to Joe Biden's side. It was like all in for Joe Biden, and completely covered up his obvious signs of periodic senility. Mark Halperin says it was clear back in 2017 that Joe Biden was mentally not there. But because he got to campaign from the basement, 2020, his campaign effectively hid his infirmity, and then the mainstream media did the best that they could to hide his cognitive infirmity from the American people. But Republicans were clear from 2020, and the right-leaning media were clear from at least 2020 that Joe Biden was clearly senile. And Mark Halperin says it's the greatest scandal in American journalism history, this cover-up of Joe Biden's obvious infirmity. So when Biden was useful as the best person to defeat Donald Trump, the media were all in to protect and praise Joe Biden. Then he turned in that disastrous debate performance June 27, and the media just turned on him. But as soon as they pushed him out of the race, the news media dropped all interest in inquiring and reporting on whether Joe Biden was even fit to retain his position as President of the United States. So people who like the status quo better than the insurgent threats to the status quo will by and large vote for Kamala Harris. And they'll take some comfort in that she is such a nothing, that she doesn't stand for anything. They feel confident that she will simply take the advice of her staff, and that they can mount an operation around her, and she will fill in the blanks. She will read the scripts that they prepare for her, that she will nominally endorse the policies that they lay out for her. It will be a triumph for the deep state if Kamala Harris wins. And it's not an insignificant case, right? There's enough instability with Donald Trump that I can see how a person of goodwill would fear having Donald Trump return to the White House, and would prefer someone as insecure, lacking in conviction as Kamala Harris, that particularly as she'll be facing a Republican Senate and likely a Republican House of Representatives, that she won't be able to pass any major destructive legislation, that she will perform the job as essentially she's instructed by her betters. She has to be the least intelligent person to have a major party nomination for president. I can't remember a dimmer bulb. Steve Saylor suggests she's got an IQ in the 105 to 115 range. By comparison, like George W. Bush and John Kerry, right, they had an IQ in the 120 to 125 range. Bill Clinton, Richard Nixon probably had IQs in the 140, close to 145 range. 145 is genius. Barack Obama probably 130 IQ range. Right? He has a look at his reading list, right? The books that he endorses, right? They are far more sophisticated and intelligent than the reading list that Kamala Harris puts out, which is just absolute pablum. Okay, let's go to the chat. Where is this position, bro? We're in Westwood, California. We're walking around UCLA. Listened to an interesting breakdown of Coach Red Pill yesterday. Oh yeah, tell me about that. Right, he thought he could go live in Ukraine and crap on Ukraine while they're fighting for their life against Russia. First politically and philosophically profound statement that I heard Luke make: there's no magic key to life. Yeah, there's a substantial constituency in the United States that wants no more forever wars. And this position gets very little attention or respect from the mainstream media. She can't put together a decent interview on TV even when she has all the questions. She did not have to go through a primary. She was installed. Yeah, she could never have made it through a Democratic primary. We'll see if Trump delivers any of his promises from the first term building that wall. Well, Trump delivered some of his promises. He built about 120 miles of new wall, and he replaced a couple hundred miles of old wall that was falling apart. So Trump will make some progress on his promises, whether it's 5% progress or 50%. Yeah, Kamala's own father isn't particularly proud of her. Mark Halperin continues to platform sharp as attack Jonathan Alter. But Jonathan Alter is very smart. He's a man of the left. And what's great about Halperin is that he has people from all over the. Thank you. Thank you. Bless you. Thank you. Halperin has people all over the political spectrum. Jonathan Alter was a long-time columnist for Newsweek. It's good to hear different perspectives. The MAGA base of poor and working class whites and flyover country will see if he drops warmed over Reaganism and actually enacts policies to help these people enhance their interests. Well, he substantially did in his first term. For the first time, the least educated Americans saw a substantial gain in their income and their living standards, right? He was the first American president to do this in 60 plus years. The Republicans will definitely win the Senate, and they will likely keep the House. If Trump wins, the Republicans, right now, Republicans are probably 75% likely to win the House, 75% likely to win the presidency, and probably 90% likely to win control of the U.S. Senate. Yeah, good point. Not a fan of Kamala Harris, but law school graduates who become prosecutors usually more intelligent than a 105 IQ. Yeah, that's why I disagree with Steve Saylor. He suggested 105 to 115. I would see it much more in the 115 to 120 range. I attended UCLA in the 1990s, was already a far left totalitarian sewer. So I am pleasantly surprised. I am getting a lot more acknowledgement and joy and people wanting to shake my hands over the past few weeks compared to abuse for walking around with a yarmulke. So I have Mexicans, black people, street people, homeless people, all yell at me that they stand with Israel. So there's a change in sentiments on the ground. Initially, after October 7, I was more likely to receive abuse from random street people for walking around with a yarmulke. But now that Israel is fighting back so effectively, Israel standing with the homeless, the mentally ill, the randos that I encounter on the street and want to shake my hand and smile and say, I'm Israel, hi, and the like. Big, profound change in the street people sentiment, shifting in a pro-Israel direction. That's just my first-hand experience from the past month. Like, now that Israel has definitively shown itself to be winning in a big way, right? The street people I encounter have overwhelmingly swung in a pro-Israel direction. While it used to be, the street people were far more likely to be anti-Jewish. I'm getting all these random street people, usually black or Mexican, coming up to me to talk about how much they love Israel, pray for Israel, support the Jews. Reminds me when I used to hang out at this library every day during the summer, and this woman would just give me money. She thought I was homeless. Well, sometimes various homeless people would try to give me things. I guess they must think I dress in such a scruffy manner. They must think that I'm worse off than they are. And so they want to give me stuff. Like when a homeless people hands me a dollar bill, I wonder if I'm somehow putting off the wrong message in life. How did we get here? It's LA. Everyone has a Jewish friend or co-worker or social worker. Holy Land has good PR. Well, I'd much rather see a smiling face than a rageful face. I'd much rather hear a happy greeting. I'd much rather see joy in the demeanor of street people than anger at Jews. So Mark Halperin continues to note that he thinks Donald Trump has a much easier path to victory, and his point is backed up by Doug Solnick, who is a longtime Democratic pollster, and he had a long op-ed in the New York Times today about the paths to victory for the various candidates, how both candidates have in the bag approximately 220 electoral votes. The election will come down to the 7 battleground states. And Doug Solnick said that he repeated Mark Halperin's perspective that Trump has the Sunbelt states in the bag: Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, Georgia. So those are 4 of the swing states right there. And that Kamala had a narrow path to victory. She's got to win the 3 Rust Belt states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Philadelphia, who usually go together. So Trump was campaigning in New Mexico this week and Virginia. I like the Matter of Opinion podcast on the New York Times. So the one conservative on there is Ross Douthat. Then they have Carlos Lozada, Michelle Cottle, and Lydia Polgren, who are all on the left. And they're all castigating Donald Trump and his side for their dehumanizing language. But never occurred to them that Democrats calling Trump supporters fascists, Nazis, racists, that could possibly be dehumanizing language. And Hugh Hewitt, longtime nationally syndicated right-wing talk show host, who has varied between, never Trump, always Republican, pro-Trump, kind of goes back and forth, right? Those are 3 strands of Republican voters: never Trump, pro-Trump, always Republican. And Hugh Hewitt writes a regular column for the Washington Post, and he participates in a Washington Post podcast with lefties Jonathan Capehart and Ruth Marcus. And Hugh Hewitt just got so tired of Jonathan Capehart and Ruth Marcus this morning that he just said, I'm not going to participate in this political ad anymore. I'm leaving. He just walked off the show. To give Hugh Hewitt credit, he went on Dispatch podcast, so that's Never Trump Conservatives. And he spent an hour making the case for Donald Trump to the Never Trump crowd. I didn't have much sympathy for the Never Trump Conservatives. Right? Law and order, such a vital issue. And Donald Trump and Republicans are always more likely to support capital punishment, law and order, stronger punishment for violent criminals than Democrats. I can't think of any leading liberal or Democratic voice for capital punishment. Overwhelmingly among liberals on the left, punishment, the desire to punish, the desire for vengeance is seen as primitive, barbaric, atavistic, nativistic, racist, nationalist. Like these should be ancient medieval impulses that we overcome. And the more enlightened person goes beyond punishment to focus instead on rehabilitation. As Dennis Prager notes, all punishment contains a considerable element of vengeance. So, Never Trump conservatives base their arguments largely on process. Donald Trump is not sufficiently deferential to our democratic processes. And there's some substance to that, but compared to policy outcomes, I just think that the process argument is weak. I read Haaretz every day. It's like the New York Times of Israel. And you have column after column, news story after news story in Haaretz, how Bibi Netanyahu and his coalition are a threat to democracy. And why are they a threat to democracy? They want to get rid of Israel's current arrangement of rule by judges. So one reason that Israel's response to the October 7, 2023 attack by Hamas was so inept is that the Israeli left, which controls the judicial branch, has the ability to invalidate any law that they regard as inappropriate or wrong. Right? And so judges appoint judges, and they can overrule any law, and they can impose all sorts of restrictions on the IDF so that pro-Palestine protesters could come right up to the border, and they would limit the ability of the IDF as much as possible to shoot pro-Palestine mobs that were threatening the border, that were throwing stones. And they limited the ability of the Israeli Air Force to get into action to fight off the invasion October 7th. And so that was limited for hours. And they never woke up Bibi Netanyahu. So on October 6th, 2023, Bibi Netanyahu and his wife were on vacation. And there are all these protesters who are just trying to make as much noise as possible outside Bibi's house to make it as difficult for him to get sleep as possible. And when the IDF and the Shin Bet, the Israeli intelligence services, saw all these preparations made for a massive Hamas invasion of southern Israel, they did not wake up Bibi Netanyahu. And so when he finally woke up and checked in what was going on, there was a massive invasion that was going down. And much of the Shin Bet and the Air Force and the IDF is run by a left-wing Ashkenazi elite who hate Bibi Netanyahu and who feel much more in common with European cosmopolitan bourgeois liberal values than they do with any distinctive Jewish state, Jewish nationalism. So Bibi has had to fight the left-wing bias in his own intelligence service, his own IDF, the protesters who successfully got many Israelis to stop doing their reserve duty for the 2 years prior to the invasion. And elite media and elite institutions in Israel, which are overwhelmingly on the left. In addition to world opinion, he's had to fight on so many fronts. It's amazing how successful he's been. And that Bibi Netanyahu is regarded as trashing Israeli democracy when he wants restrictions on the ability of judges to invalidate laws passed by the Parliament of Israel, right? The democratically elected Parliament of Israel. Bibi wants to make Israel more democratic. Now, there are ways that people on the right want to restrict democracy. There are ways that people on the left want to restrict democracy. It's not like the center, center-right, right, left, center-left are all definitively positioned on the pro or anti-democracy continuum. Right? There are some ways that Republicans are consistently more pro-democracy than Democrats, and there are going to be other ways that people on the left are more pro-democracy than Republicans. But most of the arguments about Donald Trump being a threat to democracy are tendentious, they're pretentious, they are performative, and they simply don't land with ordinary people who are often struggling paycheck to paycheck. And it's interesting how the right is a threat to democracy dominates the mainstream and left-wing Israeli media and dominates the mainstream and left-wing American media. Now, one response that some Israelis thought of when 250 of their fellow citizens were taken hostage is just cut off all food and water to Gaza until the hostages are returned. And I think that's a strong argument. Why should Gazans be allowed food, water, electricity, as long as their elected representatives, their controlling power, Hamas, holds Israeli hostages? Gaza launched this war. Gaza has functioned as an independent state for the past 16 years. Right? All Jews left Gaza by 2006. There were elections. People in Gaza elected Hamas. Hamas slaughtered anyone who challenged their power over Gaza. Gaza functions as an independent state. Gaza invades Israel. Why would Israel not seize land in retaliation? Why would Israel allow water, food, electricity, and aid to flow into Gaza while Gaza holds hundreds of Israeli hostages? Now, there's a lot of pressure in world media on Bibi Netanyahu to describe his plan for Gaza after the end of the war with Hamas. And Bibi is in a tough place, just like most of us, in that frequently we cannot say what we mean. And so it should be no surprise that he doesn't mean what he says. Right? He cannot spell exactly out his intentions because that would endanger his relationship with the United States and Israel's ability to get the weapons that it needs to fight on the seven-front war. So Bibi has to keep saying things that he doesn't mean, and he cannot tell you what he really plans, what he really means, what he truly intends, because the price would be too high. And many of us are in relationships like that, whether at work or in a marriage or in our community or with certain friends. Right? We should be able to have empathy for Bibi Netanyahu on this score. if we said what we truly believe, right, we'd lose the relationship, lose the job, lose our communal standing, lose our place in the social pecking order, lose all sorts of social connections that give our life joy and meaning and sustenance. So if people are consistently not telling you the truth, it's probably worth asking, have I incentivized them? What the? Okay, I guess the Waymo had the right of way there. I thought a Waymo just ran a stop sign. But no, the Waymo had the right of way. I'm very impressed by the way these Waymo cars operate. They don't seem to go above the speed limit. They seem to obey the law. They seem to drive much more carefully than 95% plus of drivers, of human drivers. Man, there's so much great stuff on Netflix right now. I want to finish season 1 of The Firm on Amazon Prime. I want to finish watching the Game 7 Prime Sports documentary series. And right now I'm on episode 3 of a 3-part episode on the 2004 Boston Red Sox, when they came from 3 games down to the New York Yankees to eventually win the World Series. And season 2 of The Diplomat, starring Kerry Russell, has dropped. Season 1 was so much fun. There's a new season of Cadillac Lawyer that I want to see. I want to finish watching the Vince McMahon documentary on Netflix. I watched episode 8 of American Sports Story, the Aaron Hernandez narrative. He was the tight end for the New England Patriots that murdered people. This was the first episode, right? The first one out of 8 episodes that doesn't have long scenes of him having gay sex. So Ryan Murphy, executive producer, is gay, and whenever Ryan Murphy produces a program, it invariably contains long scenes of gay sex. So, embarrassment of riches right now on Netflix. All right, we're under 100 hours away from the election. Can't wait. Talk to you blokes later. Bye-bye.